Greetings to all C3RF members and friends across Canada, indeed around the world, and a special welcome to our friends at Veterans for Freedom on their dedicated streaming channels as they view this video summary of the C3RF update for 16 May 2025. The title of this update is The Hard Thing, and it begins by noting that last week's update used the analogy of a steam-driven train straining to overcome the inertia of its own resting mass before reaching speed and turning that same mass into an unstoppable momentum. This analogy was then applied to Canada's own experience with its Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As with the accelerating locomotive, our charter would leave the station in 1982 with great promise and fanfare, only to become a runaway train speeding away from, not towards, its initial guarantees of enshrining the individual fundamental rights of each and every Canadian citizen. It would become the unfreedom train. By definition, a runaway train might be the result of a mechanical failure or loss of operator control, and in the case of our unfreedom train, it would appear that the operator, in the form of a representative democracy, had been totally removed from the controls. In the case of the Canadian unfreedom train, it was postulated that its operator was eased out of the controller's chair through a gradual, almost imperceptible process. As the frog is placed in a pot of warm water whose temperature is gradually increased to the boiling point, so it was with Canadians as they went through a process that ramped up through convincing, cajoling, coercing, to eventually commanding adherence to freedom-crushing initiatives and narratives. The examples are plentiful and included the illegal invocation of martial law to shut down what should have been charter-sanctioned protests and the floating of an online harms act that would have warmed the heart of Big Brother in Orwell's novel 1984. The former embarrassment stands in stark contrast to a strong and free Canada, as the same government that invoked the Emergencies Act is unapologetic and is appealing the ruling that it deemed to be illegal. Meanwhile, the latter initiative is simmering on the background, awaiting its inevitable retabling by a newly elected Liberal government. It is interesting to note that there is much evidence that would suggest our unfreedom train's operator, in the form of a representative democracy, was eased out of the control cab by an array of internationalized entities. The Canadian exercise in martial law in 2022, for example, can be seen to be downstream of what is now known to be collusion between the U.S. National Institute of Health and the Wuhan Virology Laboratory in China. It is now clear that gain-of-function activities gave the world the infamous Wuhan virus that ultimately drove experimental vaccines that, in turn, drove Canadian truckers to organize and execute the historic Freedom Convoy 2022 protests. In the case of Bill C-63, this hate and disinformation speech initiative can be seen to echo similar European legislation that itself was prompted by expressions of public angst over massive and reckless immigration policies that flooded the continent with fighting-age males from the Middle East and North Africa. It would be one thing if the unfreedom train was racing down the tracks towards a promised utopia, but real-life outcomes are giving Canadians cause for concern. The ambitious pledge to wrestle climate change to the ground through net zero policies, for example, has proven to be a complete bust. So it was demonstrated in Spain, Portugal, and parts of France when the power was blacked out for an unprecedented hours-long period. This widespread and extremely dangerous situation saw citizens stranded in elevators, airports shut down, and critical hospital procedures cancelled out of hand. It came on the heels of Spain proudly announcing it had achieved net zero over the entirety of its energy grid, yet a few days later, it would find itself in darkness, dragging Portugal and parts of France into the blackness with it. It now appears that the drive for net zero resulted in the cancellation of stabilizing natural gas and nuclear energy supplies. The elimination of these steady sources of power, in turn, created frequency variations that tipped whole grids into shutdown mode. The fact is that renewables, such as solar and wind, are just too variable and lack the compensating inertia afforded by more conventional fossil and nuclear energy sources. It is now becoming obvious that energy systems heavily dependent on renewables need to, quote, incorporate frequency and voltage stabilizers in the grid to counteract the loss of inertia, unquote. It would appear that high-speed, out-of-control locomotives in the form of ideologies that are allowed and encouraged to run roughshod over tried and tested without challenge are a great way to induce a train wreck. When it comes to ideologies creating train wrecks, it's hard to match the destructive power of the diversity, inclusion, and equity canon. Canadians have come to see the two-faced hypocrisy associated with a diversity that shuns and pillories certain races, an inclusiveness that berates those who hold tight to traditional family values, and a sense of equity that displaces merit with equal and undeserved outcomes. Perhaps one of the best examples of all three operating in consonance to destroy a once prized and trusted institution is that of Canada's own military. Long gone are the days when this force was organized around a meritocracy principle and a culture dedicated to winning wars, as social engineering has become the priority. And so it is today, as soldiers, sailors, and airmen are shoehorned into Marxist-style struggle sessions to atone for their white fragility, even as whiteness is linked to extremism and supremacism. The fact that die narratives are killing the institutions of the West, including the U.S. and Canadian militaries, is in the numbers. In the case of the American military, recruitment and retention levels have plummeted during the Biden administration with the onset of die-driven policies. These new strategies included the lowering of standards and the institution of quotas to better approximate required racial interest group requirements. These requirements, in turn, have been linked to the creation of weak leaders and, quote, a divisiveness that is absolutely damaging to the military as a whole, unquote. Some have argued that die is not a problem, but a solution that simply needs to be expanded and better understood. The fact remains, however, that drastic improvements in the dire recruitment and retention situation occurred in lockstep with the new Trump administration and its move away from, quote, woke Marxist social experiment, unquote. Is this a coincidence? One is left wondering how it is that the hard thing of breaking the back of wokeism, an ideology that has been cemented into place in the West over many, many decades, could come so quickly in a Trump administration. And it's not just about reinstalling a warfighting military. It's about walking away from climate change, Agenda 2030 as a whole, and the World Health Organization. All of the global institutions that have taken over Canada's decision-making processes over the course of the past 10 years. The fact that the Americans have managed to do such a hard thing speaks to an attribute of representative democracy that receives precious little recognition. It's the ability to autocorrect. It's little wonder that this aspect of majority rule falls by the wayside when woke narratives that are dedicated to finding fault are left unchallenged. They will bang away on slavery all day long, but will never acknowledge the autocorrect that was the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. Meanwhile, the slaves in Mauritania toil away in obscurity. Doing the hard thing on behalf of those you are sworn to serve comes eventually, but naturally, in a representative democracy. After all, and as friend of C3RF Julius Ruchel has stated, a society is on the path towards complete loss of faith in its leadership once the, quote, threshold of the masses no longer views their governance systems as fair, timely, and impartial, unquote. As seen in the American instance, the process that sees the will of the people rising to irresistible levels was aided immeasurably by an ability to exchange ideas and opinions freely. This was accommodated with the opening up of the Twitter social media platform, now X, by Elon Musk in 2022, the same year that Freedom Convoy 2022 hit the streets of Ottawa. The Twitter files would follow thereafter, and the American public would come to know just how aggressively their government had manipulated and censored their impressions of the world around them. It goes without saying that if Canadians are going to accomplish their own hard tasks, they will need to have free speech. And they will need to fight as hard as they can against initiatives like Revitalize Bill C-63 that would take that speech away. In closing, a reminder to join us at CanadianCitizens.org, where you can see this update in its full glory, including links to all these cited documents. Simply go to the News tab at the top of the page and select C3RF member updates from its drop-down menu. Until next time, this is Russ Cooper signing off, wishing you and yours much happiness and freedom from C3RF.